Picture this. October 1944. A wounded Japanese soldier named Hiroshi lies bleeding in a shell crater on Saipan. His rifle is empty. His unit is destroyed. An American medic approaches. Hiroshi braces for torture. He's been told Americans cut off fingers and burn prisoners alive. Instead, the medic bandages his wounds and offers him a Hershey's chocolate bar. Hiroshi stares in complete shock. According to everything he's been taught, this American should be cutting off his fingers one by one. But here he is, sharing candy like they're old friends. This simple act would shatter everything Hiroshi believed about his enemies. And he wasn't alone. Thousands of Japanese soldiers would experience the same shock. A kindness so simple, yet so devastating to everything they'd been taught. Welcome to POWs Tales. Today we're uncovering how cigarettes and chocolate became the most powerful weapons in the Pacific War. Not for killing, but for breaking minds. Two ordinary objects, a cigarette and a chocolate bar, would prove more powerful than any bullet. What you just heard wasn't fiction. During the Pacific War, thousands of Japanese soldiers experienced psychological shock more devastating than any bomb. They discovered that everything they'd been told about American demons was completely wrong. This is POWs Tales, where we dive deep into the untold stories that challenge everything we think we know about war and enemies. Today's story takes us inside the minds of Japanese soldiers who had been programmed from childhood to choose death over capture. Men who expected to be skinned alive by American savages only to receive medical care and Hershey bars instead. To understand their shock, you need to understand how Japanese soldiers were programmed for death. From day one of military service, every Japanese soldier learned one phrase by heart. Death is lighter than a feather, duty heavier than a mountain. This wasn't just a motto, it was psychological programming. They were told their families would be dishonored if they were captured alive. Their names would be struck from family records. Their children would be outcasts. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the Pearl Harbor attack, later wrote, "We were taught that to be captured alive was worse than 1,000 deaths." But the programming went deeper. Japanese soldiers were shown fabricated photos of American torture chambers. They were told detailed stories about how Americans would cut off their fingers one by one, pull out their teeth, burn them with cigarettes. The propaganda was so effective that in the entire Battle of Guadalcanal, only 1,000 Japanese prisoners were taken out of 36,000 casualties. The rest chose death. These men weren't just soldiers. They were walking time bombs, programmed to self-destruct, rather than face the horrors they believed awaited them in American hands. But what happened when that programming collided with reality would change everything. And the trigger wasn't bombs or bullets. It was a simple act of kindness so shocking, it reprogrammed their minds in an instant. Hit that subscribe button for more incredible POW stories. And let's dive into this mind-bending tale of how candy conquered hate. Private Yasuo Kuwahara was a kamikaze pilot whose plane was shot down over the Philippines. When he bailed out, he expected immediate torture and death. Instead, Marine Corporal Danny Peterson from Iowa found him wounded and terrified. Peterson's first act? He shared his K rations with the enemy pilot. Kuwahara later wrote, "I was certain I would be tortured. Instead, this American demon gave me food from his own plate. My mind couldn't process it." But Peterson wasn't done. He offered Kuwahara something even more shocking, a Lucky Strike cigarette from his own pack. Kuwahara stared at that cigarette for 5 full minutes. In Japanese culture, sharing food or tobacco was reserved for family and close friends. To a Japanese soldier, a cigarette wasn't just tobacco, it was family. Sharing one was a bond stronger than words. This enemy was treating him like a brother. And across the Pacific, American medics shocked prisoners by treating them with the same care as their own similar scenes played out across the Pacific. At Iwo Jima, medic Robert Chen from San Francisco treated wounded Japanese prisoners with the same care as American soldiers. These guys would wake up expecting execution, Chen recalled. Instead, they found themselves getting morphine and medical care. You could see their entire worldview cracking. The confusion was total. Everything these men had been programmed to expect was being contradicted by direct experience. But the real psychological breakthrough was yet to come. Sergeant Hiroshi Onoda had been captured on Luzon after a 3-day battle that decimated his unit. As he was loaded onto an American transport truck, bleeding from multiple wounds, he was convinced this was his final journey to a torture chamber where he would be slowly murdered for information. Instead, the truck delivered him to a field hospital where American doctors treated his wounds with the same care given to their own soldiers. But even medical treatment could be explained away. Perhaps Americans wanted him healthy for more effective torture. What couldn't be explained was what happened during his first interrogation. His American interrogator, a young lieutenant who looked barely older than Onoda's younger brother, sat across from him in a simple wooden chair. No torture devices, no threatening guards, just two men facing each other across a small table. Then the officer did something that broke Onoda's mind completely. He offered him a piece of Hershey's chocolate, not as a reward for information, not as a bribe or manipulation tactic, just a simple gesture. One human being offering something sweet to another. I had never tasted anything so sweet, Onoda wrote in his secret diary years later. But it wasn't the taste that destroyed my understanding of the world. It was that my supposed demon enemy chose to share something precious with me, expecting nothing in return. This scene repeated thousands of times across the Pacific. American soldiers, many barely out of their teens themselves, were spontaneously offering their personal rations to enemy prisoners who had been trying to kill them just hours before. The generosity defied all logic. Chocolate was incredibly precious in the Pacific theater, often the only sweet thing soldiers saw for months. A single Hershey bar could be traded for cigarettes, writing paper, or other valuable items. Yet American GIs were giving them away to enemy prisoners. At the Guadalcanal Field Hospital, Navy Corpsman Jim Sullivan from Boston described treating a wounded Japanese naval officer. This guy's uniform was soaked in blood. He'd lost half his unit, and he was shaking with terror, expecting us to torture him. I gave him some chocolate while waiting for the morphine to kick in. The look on his face, like I'd just performed a miracle. Many prisoners initially refused the chocolate and cigarettes, convinced they were poisoned or part of elaborate psychological torture schemes designed to break their will. They had been trained to expect deception from their enemies. But as days passed without the promised brutality, as American guards continued offering small kindnesses with no apparent ulterior motive, even the most resistant prisoners began to accept that this enemy kindness was genuine. Staff Sergeant Kenji Doihara, captured during the Saipan invasion, wrote in his diary, "I have been here for 2 weeks. Every day I expect the torture to begin. Instead, the American guards bring me cigarettes and ask about my family. I am angry now, not at them, but at our officers who told me Americans were inhuman monsters. They made me afraid of the very kindness I needed most. The chocolate and cigarettes weren't just treats. They were psychological weapons more powerful than any bomb, shattering decades of carefully constructed propaganda in minutes of unexpected human warmth. But the real psychological transformation was just beginning. Dr. Kazuo Yamamoto was a Japanese military psychologist who became a prisoner himself on Okinawa. He documented his own psychological collapse in secret notes. "The first cigarette was the hardest to accept," he wrote. "My mind screamed it was poisoned. But eventually, physical need overcame psychological programming. But accepting the cigarette was just step one. The real crisis came when prisoners realized American kindness wasn't manipulation. It was simply human decency extended to defeated enemies. This created what Yamamoto called the collapse of the enemy concept. These men had been taught that Americans were a different species, demons without souls or honor. When this fundamental belief proved false, everything else they'd been taught came crashing down. Corporal Takeshi Yamada described the process. "First, I thought they were tricking me. Then I thought it was some strange American procedure. It took weeks to accept they were simply being kind because they chose to be. Prisoners cycled through denial, anger, depression, and finally acceptance, not of torture, but of kindness. Imagine being raised to believe your enemy was a monster, then discovering he saves your life and offers you candy." The anger phase was particularly intense. Prisoners weren't angry at their captors. They were furious at the Japanese military system that had lied to them about American character. But the final stage, acceptance, brought something unexpected. American intelligence officers quickly discovered that traditional interrogation methods failed completely with Japanese prisoners. Major Robert Sherwood wrote, "These men expected torture and had mentally prepared for it. Harsh treatment only confirmed their propaganda and made them clam up completely." But Captain Daniel Inouye, a Japanese-American officer, developed a revolutionary approach he called the cigarette protocol. Instead of harsh questioning, prisoners received medical care identical to American wounded. They were given familiar food when possible. Most importantly, they were offered cigarettes and candy not as rewards for cooperation, but as simple human kindness. The results were extraordinary. Men who had been prepared to die rather than reveal military secrets began volunteering information within days. Sergeant Nobuo Fujita, a naval aviator, described his experience. "I expected torture and death. Instead, my interrogator offered me tea and spoke to me as one warrior to another. He showed me photos of his family. By the end, I wanted to help him understand our military strategies. The cigarette protocol wasn't just gathering intelligence. It was creating something unprecedented in warfare, genuine cooperation between bitter enemies. Prisoners who experienced American humanity became powerful advocates for surrender among their fellow soldiers. Word spread through Japanese units that captured soldiers were being treated with honor, not tortured as promised. This had measurable impact. Japanese surrender rates increased dramatically as the war progressed. But the most remarkable transformations were still to come. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai was Japan's most famous fighter ace. Shot down near Guadalcanal, he initially attempted suicide multiple times, refusing all American help. The breakthrough came through tobacco addiction. Australian guard Jack Morrison noticed Sakai's withdrawal symptoms and began leaving cigarettes near his bed, not for interrogation, but from simple compassion. For weeks, Sakai ignored them, but eventually, physical craving overcame psychological resistance. That first cigarette led to a conversation. Morrison began bringing technical aviation magazines, sharing stories, showing family photos. Within months, Sakai had transformed from would-be suicide to one of the most cooperative prisoners in the camp. He provided detailed intelligence about Japanese aircraft and tactics, but more importantly, he had undergone complete psychological transformation. After the war, Sakai wrote, "The cigarettes Jack gave me saved my life, not because of the tobacco, but because they showed me enemies could choose to be human." And Sakai wasn't alone. These moments of compassion were quietly reshaping the war itself. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, experienced similar transformation. Expecting execution as a war criminal, he instead found American officers treating him with professional respect. The turning point came when an intelligence officer offered Fuchida chocolate while discussing Pearl Harbor. Here was a man whose countrymen I had killed, offering me sweets from his own rations. I realized Americans were capable of forgiveness I never thought possible. These weren't isolated cases. They were happening thousands of times across the Pacific Theater. The psychological transformation wasn't contained within POW camps. It was creating ripples that changed the entire war. At Cowra POW camp in Australia, the transformation created a dramatic split. Hardline prisoners planned a mass breakout designed to end in their deaths, collective suicide to preserve honor. At Australia's Cowra POW camp, kindness split the prisoners. Some joined a mass suicide breakout, but hundreds refused, believing survival was now more honorable. This psychological revolution began spreading to active Japanese units. The whisper that capture could mean survival, not torture, fundamentally changed behavior on the battlefield. Intelligence reports from 1944 to 1945 document increasing Japanese surrenders rather than suicidal last stands, a fundamental shift in behavior that had massive strategic implications. American troops were also affected. Soldiers who initially viewed all Japanese as inhuman fanatics began seeing them as individuals capable of reason and friendship. This attitude shift influenced post-war planning. Military leaders who had direct experience with transformed Japanese prisoners became advocates for generous, rehabilitative treatment of defeated Japan rather than vengeful punishment. The cigarettes and chocolate were creating the foundation for post-war reconciliation. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, thousands of transformed Japanese prisoners faced an uncertain future. They were returning to a homeland that would view them as dishonored cowards. The repatriation process became another opportunity for American kindness. Instead of simply loading prisoners onto ships, American authorities gave them new clothes, medical care, and gifts, often including cartons of cigarettes and boxes of chocolate for their families. Lieutenant Kuwahara, our former kamikaze pilot, described his departure. "The same Americans who could have shot me as a war criminal instead gave me medicine for my family and chocolate for children I'd never met. I wept with confusion and gratitude." But returning to Japan was brutal. Many families refused to acknowledge their sons, holding funerals for them and considering them socially dead. However, those psychologically transformed by American experience responded differently. Instead of accepting shame, many became advocates for new understanding of honor and warfare. Hiroshi Onoda returned to find his family had held his funeral. Instead of accepting social death, he challenged his community. "I learned from my enemies that there is honor in survival, honor in learning, honor in forgiveness. The Americans taught me more about true honor than our officers ever did." Such statements were shocking in post-war Japan, but they resonated with a population questioning militaristic values that had led to national destruction. These former prisoners became bridges between Japanese society and American occupation forces. The psychological transformation that began with cigarettes and chocolate had implications extending far beyond individual lives. Many former prisoners became key figures in post-war Japanese society as businessmen, politicians, educators, and cultural leaders. Their transformed understanding of America helped shape Japan's remarkable transition from enemy to ally. General MacArthur actively recruited former prisoners to serve as translators and cultural advisors during occupation. These men helped explain American policies to skeptical civilians and provided insights into Japanese culture. Former prisoner Saburo Sakai spent the rest of his life promoting Japanese-American friendship, often crediting his transformation to the simple human kindness he experienced in captivity. The cigarette protocol, developed during the Pacific War, became standard practice in subsequent American conflicts. Military manuals began emphasizing psychological understanding over physical coercion. The success demonstrated the power of soft power, influencing others through attraction rather than force. This understanding became central to post-war American foreign policy, from the Marshall Plan to cultural exchange programs. The relationships formed between guards and prisoners lasted decades. Many maintained correspondence for 40 years, with former enemies becoming lifelong friends. Jack Morrison and Saburo Sakai exchanged letters until Morrison's death. Their correspondence later published as a testament to the possibility of reconciliation between bitter enemies. But perhaps the most important legacy was proving that enemies created by circumstances could become friends through choice. As we look at our own world of bitter divisions, this history asks us a question: what is the true nature of an enemy? The answer isn't a weapon. It's found in a small display case at the National Museum of the Pacific War in Texas. A half-empty pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes and a faded Hershey's chocolate wrapper. These items were donated by the family of Yasuo Kuwahara, our former kamikaze pilot, who kept them for 60 years after the war ended, not as military souvenirs or historical curiosities, but as sacred symbols of the moment when his understanding of enemies, friendship, and human nature was forever transformed. The museum placard tells visitors that these objects represent the transformative power of human kindness during wartime. But their true significance and their lesson for us today goes far deeper. This kindness wasn't naive. It came from strength. It was the powerful choice to see the human behind the propaganda, a choice that proved more powerful than any bomb. The cigarette represents the moment when Japanese prisoners realized that their supposedly demon enemies were capable of sharing rather than taking, of offering comfort rather than inflicting pain, of treating defeated opponents with dignity rather than degradation. It challenged everything they had been systematically taught about American character and forced them to confront the possibility that their entire understanding of the conflict was based on lies and propaganda. The chocolate wrapper represents sweetness discovered in the midst of bitterness, hope found in the depths of despair, humanity preserved in the heart of inhuman conflict. For men who had been conditioned to believe that capture meant dishonor worse than death, a piece of chocolate offered in friendship became irrefutable proof that honor could be found in the most unexpected places and circumstances. Together, these simple objects tell a story that fundamentally challenges our assumptions about the nature of warfare, the immutable character of enemies, and the possibilities for human transformation even in the most desperate circumstances. The Japanese prisoners who couldn't believe they were given cigarettes and chocolate teach us that enemies are often just people on the opposite side of misunderstanding, fear, and systematic misinformation. When that misunderstanding is replaced with genuine human contact, when fear is overcome by actual experience, and when propaganda is contradicted by undeniable reality, remarkable transformation becomes not just possible, but inevitable. The American Marines who shared their personal rations with captured kamikaze pilots, the guards who offered precious cigarettes to men they had been trained to hate, the medics who treated enemy wounded with the same professional care they gave to their own comrades. These individuals made moral choices that reverberated far beyond their immediate circumstances. Their decisions to choose kindness over cruelty, understanding over hatred, humanity over revenge helped create the foundation for Japan's transformation from America's most bitter and fanatical enemy to one of its closest and most reliable allies. The cigarettes and chocolate that shocked Japanese prisoners over 70 years ago continue to offer us a powerful model for approaching our own contemporary conflicts and divisions with genuine humanity unwavering dignity, and the radical hope that people who seem to be irredeemable enemies can indeed become trusted friends. In the end, the most powerful weapon in the Pacific wasn't a bomb or a bullet. It was a bar of chocolate and a single cigarette, shared between enemies. If this story of unexpected transformation moved you, share it with others who might need to hear that change is always possible, that understanding can overcome even the deepest hatred, and that sometimes the smallest gestures of kindness can make the biggest difference in human history. Subscribe to this channel for more incredible stories that remind us not just of humanity's capacity for conflict and destruction, but of our even greater capacity for compassion, understanding, redemption, and hope. Can you imagine being captured as an enemy soldier, locked behind barbed wire thousands of miles from home, stripped of your freedom, your dignity, your future, and yet somehow finding a way to send money to your starving family back in war-torn Italy? This sounds impossible, doesn't it? Like some fairy tale concocted by Hollywood scriptwriters who've never experienced the brutal reality of war. But what I'm about to tell you isn't fiction or propaganda. What I'm about to tell you, actually, happened to 51,000 Italian soldiers during World War II. And their story will not only challenge everything you thought you knew about prisoners of war, it will restore your faith in the power of human dignity, love, and the unbreakable bonds that connect families through hardship and across oceans. How do you send money through a war behind barbed wire? Picture this. By 1943, Europe was a graveyard. Millions were fighting wars they never asked for, leaving behind wives, children, and parents who may never see them again. In this global catastrophe, over 600,000 Italian soldiers have been captured by Allied forces. Instead of vanishing into brutal camps, about 51,000 were shipped to the United States and transported across the Atlantic Ocean to a country that would become not their prison, but their temporary home, the United States. And what happened to them there defies every stereotype about wartime imprisonment that has ever been created. If you're fascinated by stories that challenge everything you thought you know about history, hit that subscribe button now, because what comes next will blow your mind. In a moment, we'll see how the money actually reached Italy during wartime. Let me take you back to September 1943, when Italy signed the Armistice of Cassabile. In one stroke of a pen, the entire nature of this war changed for thousands of Italian soldiers. These men found themselves in a position that no prisoners of war in history had ever experienced. They were no longer enemies of the United States, but potential allies. Here's the shocking statistic. About 90% joined Italian service units because it meant paid work they could send home. These men, who could have spent the war sitting in prison camps, chose instead to work alongside their former enemies. But what happened to Giuseppe next will challenge everything you think you know about prison camps. They worked because families were starving, and America offered paid labor. Meet Giuseppe Romano, a 23-year-old soldier from Naples captured in the scorching sands of North Africa. He expected a miserable camp. Instead, he got a paycheck and a way to feed Maria and the kids. Due to severe labor shortages, Italian service units worked on army depots, in arsenals, hospitals, and on farms. This wasn't busy work. This was meaningful employment that the American war effort desperately needed. These men weren't just being housed and fed, they were being valued and compensated. The financial arrangements were surprisingly generous. In places like California, stipends and wages, small by US standards, converted into meaningful lire for families back home. This wasn't one family, it was thousands. Wives who thought they were widows, suddenly receiving money from husbands they assumed were dead. Children who had forgotten what it felt like to have a full belly, suddenly eating regular meals paid for by fathers they thought they'd never see again. Giuseppe's first remittance didn't buy what you'd expect. To understand the magnitude of what was happening, we need to visit one of these prisoner of war camps and see what daily life actually looked like. Camp Concordia in north-central Kansas was typical of the 155 full-scale POW camps across America. But get this. Concordia had 280 barracks, 23 auxiliary buildings, including a gymnasium, library, and 350-seat theater. These weren't the conditions we associate with prisoner camps. These men weren't just being housed. They were being treated with dignity and respect unprecedented in warfare history. And then Antonio discovered something that would change his family's life forever. Picture Antonio Ricci, a 30-year-old farmer from Tuscany, walking into that library for the first time. 6 months earlier, he'd been captured in North Africa, expecting hellish imprisonment. Instead, he found himself in a place where he could read books, watch performances, exercise in a real gymnasium. But more importantly, he could work, earn money, and send that money home to his wife Elena and their 3 children. The work opportunities were diverse and meaningful. Italian prisoners worked extensively in agriculture due to severe labor shortages as American men went to fight, but they also worked in factories, arsenals, hospitals, and military depots. Not exploited, employed with dignity. Around Boston, thousands served in ISUs, still POWs, uniforms marked only by an Italy patch. In some locations, trust grew fast. Weekend passes, meals with Italian-American families, real community. This level of trust was unprecedented and rarely betrayed. These Italian men understood they had been given an opportunity no prisoners of war had ever received, to maintain dignity, contribute meaningfully to society, and most importantly, to provide for their families while in captivity. Let me tell you about Marco Benedetti, a 26-year-old soldier from Sicily working at an army depot-adjacent facility in Ohio. The irony wasn't lost on him, manufacturing supplies that might be used against his former allies, but every paycheck meant his pregnant wife Carmela could afford medical care. His elderly parents could buy medicine. His younger sister could continue education instead of working in fields. The psychological impact was profound. Instead of feeling helpless, they felt empowered. Instead of being burdens, they were contributors. Instead of being forgotten by families, they were actively caring for them from thousands of miles away. This sense of purpose transformed what could have been demoralizing into something that strengthened their character and resolve. Step inside a barracks library, not a gulag, a place to write home. Now let me tell you about what was happening on the other side of the Atlantic, in small villages and towns of Italy, where families were receiving these impossible gifts. Imagine you're Francesca Martinelli, 31 years old, living in a village outside Rome with your 3 children, ages 4, 7, and 9. Your husband Carlo was captured at El Alamein 8 months ago, and you haven't heard from him since. The official notification said, missing in action, which might as well have said dead. War has gutted your region, food scarce, money scarcer. You've sold your wedding ring, your mother's necklace, every piece of furniture not essential for survival. Your children ask why there's no bread, why they can't have new shoes, why Papa isn't coming home. You're at your breaking point, staring into a future offering nothing but more hunger, desperation, and loss. Then, on a cold February morning in 1944, a miracle walks to your door. The postman carries a letter from America, with money inside. Real money, American dollars convertible to Italian lire, enough to buy food for a month, pay 3 months of overdue rent, buy shoes and medicine. But more than money, though God knows it's desperately needed, this letter represents something more precious. Proof Carlo is alive. Not just alive, but working, earning, thinking of you, caring for you, providing even from captivity thousands of miles away. This scene repeated thousands of times across Italy between 1943 and 1946. Wives discovering husbands weren't just alive, but thriving. Children suddenly having father's love manifested in money, meaning the difference between starvation and survival. Let me share Elena Rossi's story, documented in her diary discovered decades later by her granddaughter. Elena lived in a Tuscan farming village with her husband's parents and 4 children. When Antonio was captured in North Africa, she assumed her life was over. 24 years old, with 4 children under 10, no income, few prospects in war-torn Italy. Elena thought the money was the miracle. She had no idea what was coming next. In her March 15, 1944 diary entry, she wrote, "Today I received the impossible, money from Antonio in America. I held the letter in shaking hands and wept for an hour before opening it. Inside, with his words of love and hope, was money. Real money, enough to feed our children properly for the first time in 6 months. I don't understand how this is possible, but I don't care. My husband lives. My husband works. My husband provides. Even from prison, even across the ocean, even in this terrible war, he finds a way to care for us." These weren't just financial transactions, they were love letters written in currency. Each dollar carried a message transcending language, distance, and war. I'm alive. I'm working. I haven't forgotten you. I will provide no matter what obstacles stand in my way. Despite broken banks and dangerous mail, remittance channels, coordinated by US and Italian authorities, still delivered funds. There are documented cases of Italian women walking 20 or 30 miles to reach post offices or banks where they could collect money from imprisoned husbands. These journeys weren't easy during wartime. Travel was dangerous. Roads damaged by bombing, food and water scarce, bandits preying on travelers. But the promise of money from America was worth any hardship, any risk, any sacrifice. Maria Conti, a 33-year-old mother of 5 near Milan, kept detailed records of money received from her husband Salvatore. Between March 1944 and September 1945, her records show 11 payments totaling, equivalent to approximately 2 years of pre-war household income. But more revealing were her notes about spending, shoes and flour in March, rent and seed in April, by May, a goat for milk and a repaired roof. Each entry reveals a family gradually climbing from desperation back toward normal life, entirely because an imprisoned husband thousands of miles away found ways to care for them. If Elena's diary moved you, tap like so more families' stories are found. This story isn't just about money flowing from America to Italy. It's about remarkable relationships that develop between Italian prisoners and American hosts, relationships challenging every assumption about what war was supposed to do to the human spirit. These Italian prisoners were changing America too, but in ways nobody expected. By 1944, the United States had accepted about 51,000 Italian POWs, many of whom had never agreed with Hitler or Mussolini and never fought against the United States. These weren't ideological enemies. They were farmers, mechanics, shopkeepers, and laborers conscripted into a war they didn't understand or support. Americans began recognizing this distinction. The Catholic Church played a crucial role fostering these relationships, ministering not just to religious needs but social and emotional needs. Italian-American communities, many with families still in Italy, opened hearts and homes to these men who carried news from the homeland and reminded them of loved ones left behind. Let me tell you about the Sunday dinners that became legendary among Italian prisoners in California. Italian-American families in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and smaller communities began inviting groups of prisoners to their homes for Sunday meals. These weren't formal, supervised visits. These were genuine acts of hospitality extended to men thousands of miles from their own families. Giovanni Marcelli, a 28-year-old prisoner from Abruzzo, wrote to his wife about one such dinner. "Today I ate at the Benedetto family home in San Francisco. They came from a village just 50 kilometers from ours. We talked about olive harvest, making wine, the festival of San Giuseppe. For 4 hours, I forgot I was a prisoner. For 4 hours, I felt at home. Mrs. Benedetto cried when I showed photographs of you and the children. She said you reminded her of her daughter back in Italy. When I left, she pressed $20 into my hand and told me to send it to you. $20. From strangers who became family. These relationships weren't one-sided charity. They didn't just fill labor gaps. They boosted farms, crop rotation, pruning, enriched kitchens, regional recipes, and filled towns with music, camp performances. Trust had stakes. Lose it, lose wages, and your family's lifeline. The result? Rare escapes, minimal infractions, high productivity. In some communities, employers even petitioned for prisoners to stay after the war. Some Italian-American families formally adopted prisoners, sponsoring immigration applications and helping bring their families to America. Some fell in love with American women and stayed to build new lives in the country that treated them with dignity during their darkest hour. But here's what will shock you most. The real impact of this money went far beyond just keeping families alive. Let me tell you about Lucia Ferretti, whose story will show you the true power of these American dollars in war-torn Italy. The numbers are staggering, but it's the human stories behind them that will move you to tears. Lucia's husband was imprisoned at a camp in Texas, and with his monthly remittances providing basic security for her family, she could afford to do something incredible. She invested in an oven, flour, and baking supplies to start a small bread-baking business in her village. Within 6 months, her oven paid for itself, steady bread orders from neighbors and nearby farms. By the time her husband returned in 1946, she had established a thriving business supporting not only their family, but providing employment for 2 other village women. Let me put this in perspective with a real example. Remember Antonio from Tuscany? Back home, pay, when work existed, was meager. In US camps, monthly earnings and allowances could dwarf that, enough to change a family's trajectory. Can you imagine a prisoner of war earning more than a free man back home? But here's the beautiful part. Antonio wasn't keeping that money for himself. He was sending half of it home to Elena, giving his family purchasing power they had never dreamed possible. The ripple effect was incredible. Maria Conti's village transformed entirely. Every American dollar helped merchants reopen, schools restart, and churches repair their buildings. Shopkeepers stocked up for remittance days. Entire communities began timing their economic activity around remittance days from America. Most importantly, These remittances allowed families to invest in the future, rather than simply surviving day to day. Children forced to drop out of school to work could return to education. Families could afford medical care for illnesses that might otherwise have been ignored until life-threatening. Small businesses could be maintained or started with capital provided by imprisoned family members in America. The psychological economics were equally important. When families receive regular support, they can make longer-term decisions. They can plant gardens knowing they'll afford seeds and tools next season. They can repair homes knowing they'll have money for materials and labor. They can make plans for the future because the future has become predictable and hopeful, rather than uncertain and frightening. This pattern repeated thousands of times across Italy. Wives and mothers used security provided by American remittances to start small businesses, improve agricultural productivity, invest in children's education, and rebuild communities. Money sent by Italian prisoners wasn't just keeping families alive, it was laying foundations for Italy's post-war economic recovery. That one letter didn't just feed a family, it launched Lucia's business. And then came 1945, and the decision that would break thousands of hearts. As the war in Europe drew to a close in 1945, the question of what to do with these Italian prisoners became increasingly complex. Many had established lives, relationships, and economic arrangements in America they were reluctant to abandon. Many American employers and communities were equally reluctant to see them leave. 14,000 POW repatriations were delayed in 1946, so prisoners could continue working. Some didn't want to leave. They had found meaningful work, earned good money, formed deep friendships, and in some cases, fallen in love with American women. The country that had been their prison had become their home. Now imagine you're that Italian prisoner, earning more money than you ever dreamed possible. But then comes the hardest decision of your life. The decision-making process was agonizing for many families. Wives in Italy were desperate to be reunited with husbands they hadn't seen for years. Children wanted fathers to come home. But economic reality was stark. Money being earned in America was still desperately needed to rebuild lives and communities devastated by war. Consider Roberto Santangelo's dilemma, a carpenter from Sicily working in a North Carolina furniture factory. By early 1946, he was earning wages allowing substantial support to his wife and 4 children while saving for their future. His American employer had offered permanent employment and was willing to sponsor immigration. His wife's letters begged him to come home, but also acknowledged the money he was earning was still crucial for survival. His wife Isabella wrote in February 1946, "My beloved husband, I want you home more than my next breath, but I also know what you earn there in 1 month is more than you could earn here in 6 months, if you could find work at all. Our oldest son needs to continue education. Our youngest daughter needs medical treatment for weak lungs. If you come home now, we'll be together but poor. If you stay another year, you could save enough to give us all a future. The choice breaks my heart, but I trust your wisdom." This letter captures the impossible choice facing thousands of Italian families. Love versus economic security, emotional needs versus practical needs, the present versus the future. Many prisoners chose to stay for extended periods, continuing to send money home while building resources for eventual return. Others chose immediate family reunion, trusting that love and determination would overcome economic hardships. Still others chose to bring families to America, using savings and American contacts to start entirely new lives. Goodbyes were raw. Many friendships became lifelong correspondence. The farewell parties thrown by American communities for departing Italian prisoners became legendary. In Hereford, Texas, the entire town turned out to say goodbye to Italian prisoners who had worked local farms for nearly 3 years. The local newspaper described it as the most emotional community gathering in the town's history. Local residents had prepared care packages filled with American goods still scarce in Italy: coffee, chocolate, canned goods, clothing, and small gifts for wives and children they had never met but heard about in countless conversations. Italian prisoners, many leaving behind the highest-paying jobs they had ever held, wept openly, saying goodbye to people who had started as strangers and become family. When Giuseppe Romano stepped off that ship in Naples in January 1946, he came home not defeated, but as the father who never stopped providing. His children didn't just remember their father as the man who left, they remembered him as the man who never abandoned them. The money he sent had kept them in school, paid for medical care, maintained their dignity within their community, and created a foundation of savings, allowing the family to rebuild their lives in post-war Italy. The story of Italian prisoners sending money home while captive in America established precedents, changed attitudes, and created possibilities that continue influencing how we think about conflict, captivity, dignity, and human potential. This story challenges our most basic assumptions about war and imprisonment. We assume war dehumanizes people, captivity destroys dignity, enemies cannot become friends, prisoners cannot be productive society members. The experience of these 51,000 Italian men proves all these assumptions false. Their legacy reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hour, even behind wire, dignity and duty crossed oceans. Every dollar sent from American prison camps to Italian families was proof that the human spirit cannot be imprisoned, that love cannot be defeated, and that families can be supported and strengthened even across the greatest distances and through the most difficult trials. As we face our own challenges and uncertainties, let us remember the Italian prisoners of war who proved that even in captivity, even in global conflict, even when everything seems hopeless, the human spirit finds ways to provide, protect, and build bridges instead of walls. Their story calls us to be better than our circumstances, stronger than our fears, more generous than our grievances. It reminds us that every act of dignity, every gesture of compassion, every choice to provide for others rather than just ourselves, contributes to a story still being written, a story of human potential that knows no limits and recognizes no boundaries. Captured men sent hope home. That's how you send money through a war. If this incredible story moved you, imagine what other untold tales of human resilience are waiting to be discovered. Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because history's most amazing stories are often the ones nobody talks about. Want the German POWs in America story next? Comment, tell the German story. Subscribe for that one.